Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. As always, I'm Heather Burnt-Santy, but I'm really excited today. I'm joined by Ann Pello, and she's written many things, and I'll let her talk about herself here in a minute. But we're going to be talking a little bit about the book From Teaching to Thinking together on this episode. So welcome, Ann. Why should people listen to you?
Thanks, Heather. Hello. Why should people listen to me? What my hope is that people listen to me as a person in still finding my way in this landscape of early childhood, wanting to just puzzle out how we can continue to bring our living into best alignment with what we care most about for childhood and for children, and for ourselves as folks who work with and care for children. So listening to me as a fellow thinker, a fellow wanderer, a fellow practitioner.
Okay.
For sure.
Great. Well, I have to say I've read lots of your work and I appreciate it so much. And I just can't even believe that I get to talk to you about this newest book today. I'm so excited. So we're going to, the book honestly is so packed. Like when I first started talking to people at Exchange Press about wanting to have you on the show, I was like, I'd have to have 700 conversations with her to really dig deep into this book. And you co-authored it with Margie Carter. I should mention that too. So we sort of have narrowed it down to a conversation about observing, and maybe that will lead to some documentation. What I liked about your approach, and I promise the quote's coming, is that it's really much more about process than product. And anytime I think we can reframe something we're doing for young children in terms of the process and the humanity of it, as opposed to the checklist we've got to get through or the goals we want to measure. Yeah. But I love that you kind of give us permission here to do that. So the quote is, it's part of a story you tell about Mandy, who's an early childhood educator, and there's sort of a problem behavior with a little boy that she's going to do some observing to try and figure out, which I think is a really common relatable scenario.
Yep.
And what you say here is, these few moments held a transformation of experience for Mandy. She shifted from classroom cop to curious observer. She advocated for Austin's goodness rather than admonishing him as naughty. She got a glimpse of another person's humanness and got to act on behalf of that humanness. That was powerful for me because most often when I'm talking to early childhood people about observation, it's either to measure their development or to solve a behavior problem. And this description of Mandy's experience is such a shift.
Yeah, and it was for her. She, in sharing that experience that she had, she named, like, why my thinking got really shaken up here. Both my thinking about Austin and the assumptions I'd made about him that had led me to put my eagle eye on him, but also my thinking got shaken up about what my practice of teaching can be, that I can be an advocate for, an ally to children, rather than, as you say, someone trying to solve a behavior problem, keep control in the classroom, make sure everyone's sort of on track and we're on time and we're putting out fires. And as we go, if we can collect a little bit of data that's going to help us fill out the assessments that are mandated by our funders, then that's frosting on the cake.
Sure.
But instead of if we bring to children our curiosity, our delight in them, our awareness of them as full human beings, not as behavior issues, not as something to be managed, but as human beings that we're spending our days with, and who have the infinite internal landscapes that we each have, right, that are shaping their lives, then boy, everything can change. And we're with them with our open hearts and our curious minds. And in that spirit, we get called into being more fully human, more fully alive, more fully present ourselves, not those classroom cops, not those assessors, evaluators, not someone trying to be objective to get data on children. Like, forget that idea. Let's just show up with open hearts and curious minds, and be ready to be moved by the children that we're spending our days with.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk more about objectivity, because I think that's very much how we're all trained in our teacher prep courses and the workshops that we go to and the forms that we're given. We're all told to be very objective and to use, objective language and avoid subjectivity. And so part of me is okay with that. Like, I don't want to read somebody's observation note that says he was really naughty, this was his worst day. I think back to when I got a note from my son's teacher when he was 1 that said he'd been very ornery that day. And she wanted me to know, and was anything going on at home?
Oh my gosh.
So all that's
follow up with him at home, please.
Yes, yeah. But also I have to tell you, she spelled ornery HORNERY.
Oh, I love it. You're like, wow.
So it's a great story, and I'm glad I have it. But anyway, it's hard to move away from that training that we've had, and we're doing it with the best of intentions. But I love this idea of falling in love with the children we're observing and being fully present and fully human with them.
Yeah. And that idea of, as you say, that objectivity is asking us to somehow to lock all of our humanness behind some wall and be with the children only with this little sliver of who we are, with whatever our training is about child development and ages and stages, and trying to keep a tab on where kids are developmentally, rather than showing up with all of ourselves, all of who we are, available to come to know who these children are. And I love in the example you just shared about, thinking that not being objective means we're saying, oh, this was a pretty naughty kid or an ornery. that I wouldn't call that being subjective. Well, it is being subjective, but it's not in the way in which I would like to call us as a field into being self-consciously subjective. If we're being self-aware with our subjectivity, then we're talking about ourselves and our thinking about children's experience. So it's saying, like, I can only ever watch Austin, this little guy in Mandy Store, I can only ever see what he's doing through the lens of my own experiences, my values, my worries, my awareness of the director, who might pop in at any moment with some expectation of what she'd like to see me doing, my own upbringing, that we don't stand on the furniture, and here's this kid climbing up on the shelf. All of that is with us all the time. And so what I think our work is to get very aware of that, stay as clean as we can be about it, not to somehow shut all that off, that idea that we leave ourselves at the door somehow. So we show up saying, I'm continuing on this journey of self-awareness, getting more and more articulate about what I value, becoming more aware of my cultural lens and how that informs what I see and what I don't see, and informs the judgments I make about what I see. It get aware of where I feel squeezed in this field, where I feel pressures about accountability and assessments, and where I feel my own longings. Like, it's pretty darn charming that this little guy's climbed up on a shelf to get a photo of someone he loves. Like, that moves me, and that should move me. And so this idea of being subjective, first off, acknowledges that we always are objective, but asks us to be quite, to work with that subjectivity intelligently and in service of understanding the children, so that we can see them through an awareness of of the lenses that we bring.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's sort of what I was thinking. You've sort of articulated what I was trying to think about how to say when I said it's about process and not product. It's not about the compliance or the order or the happy boss or although those things are important, right? Like we want to feel like we're helping children, and we do have to pay attention to what's expected to us, but that process of being fully there. And I wondered, as I heard you talking, if that permission to be our more authentic selves in this observation process doesn't open our hearts to be more accepting, more generous towards the things we're watching and seeing in the children around us, than a simple checklist or discipline plan we're trying to write up.
Absolutely. I think I've worked with and been in lovely conversations with many people in early childhood over many years and in many countries. And no one I've met has said, I came into this work so that I could assess children in terms of their ages and stages, developmental markers. Not a single person ever has said that. On the other hand, every person has said, I am delighted by children. I every day experience my time with children as a gift, as a wellspring of joy, as a invitation into humility, and an invitation into being more human, into seeing the ways in which we all are finding our way into this world together, finding our way into those big questions: who am I, and who am you? Who are you, and who are we together? What can we create together when we give ourselves over to this shared thing called life? And that's what calls us to do this work. There's very little other reward than the reward that comes from our hearts being wide awake and alive, and our minds being invigorated, and finding community to do that in. And so my hope would be that people, as we see children's humanness, we're called into greater humanness ourselves, which allows us to see.
It's all a cycle.
It just continues to unfold.
That's beautiful. So you've used the phrase a couple of times now, delighting in children. So I'd love to hear you talk about how that's different from saying, oh, I just love kids, or I just really like being with kids. Like, what's the distinction? I love that language. I think I first saw it in Margie and Deb's book, Training Teachers, when they outlined the core dispositions of master teachers, but I think about it a lot. So what's the distinction? What does it mean, I guess, really, to delight in them?
Oh, I love that question, Heather, the way you're framing that alongside that phrase we hear so often. Oh, I love kids. Or I love
done a lot of job interviews for teachers. I've heard it so many times.
I've always loved kids. I started babysitting when I was not.
Yes, exactly.
And as I was listening to you framing that question, one thing that sparked for me was the nuance and delight that has a humility to it, or a giving over of oneself to the other, rather than a centering of myself in the dynamic. If I'm delighted by children, I'm captivated by them. I'm perplexed by them. I'm surprised by the insights they offer. I'm changed because of the interactions we have, by what I hear from children, what I see with children, and that is sort of foregrounding the children, I think, in a way that's different than, well, I love kids. And certainly there's love, there's falling in love, there's open-heartedness that comes with love, but I don't know, I'm thinking as I'm speaking that something sparked for me there about that. What's foregrounded, or what's where is our attention if
Sure.
we're delighted by children?
Sure. And I think just that idea of putting that in the foreground, changing our perspective in that way. We say, I like kids, it's really still about us. We
Mm-hmm.
say, there's a delight in being with them. I think that sort of shifts
Mm-hmm.
the focus a little bit,
Yeah.
at least in my mind. I
Mm-hmm.
can think about that. So I want to shift over to, and throw out another quote to kind of lead into going from this observation to documentation, because that's kind of another buzzword that we hear a lot about.
There is,
Certainly
yeah.
people are interested in it. And I'll tell you this, your chapter here about the documentation piece as opposed to like assessment changed my thinking a little bit, because I was very satisfied in I don't do elaborate documentation panels, but I do take lots of photos, and I
Mm-hmm.
would include then a little blurb about what children were practicing or learning, and that was
Uh-huh.
for the families, also for the grad students I'm working with, and certainly there's a place for that, but um, uh, it can be so much deeper, I
Mm-hmm.
guess is what I'm thinking now. So here's the quote I want to throw in here again, and here you talk about our stories change how people understand and value children and childhood. They can catch people off guard, as Anne Lamott says, and break in on small bordered ways of thinking about childhood and the purpose of early education and the roles of adults in children's learning. I feel like you kind of talked about that
Mm-hmm.
some, but again, it was just very powerfully written
Yeah, thank
and
you.
caught my
Yeah.
attention. So I'd love
Yeah.
to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I um the way in which documentation has sort of become formalized in our field is a very obvious extension of this mindset about assessment and tracking development and our
Mm-hmm.
kids meeting milestones and our teachers teaching useful academic skills, like that mindset of learning,
Mm-hmm.
and mark developmental milestones. And so the stories have been about that.
Right.
Here's what.
Yeah. And I
This.
use the phrase making learning visible a lot
Mm-hmm.
when I'm
Yeah.
talking about
Yep.
this. And I still believe that that's important, but I
Yep.
take us
But
in further.
in all of it, we've missed the opportunity
Uh-huh.
to again write ourselves into the story as people who are thinking deeply about children's thinking. So rather than uh, focusing only on what children are learning and what the children are learning, here's an opportunity for us to think about what we're learning or what we're wondering. And in the process of doing that, then we learn and wonder more.
Uh-huh.
So if in this little example that we've been sort of referring to, this little guy climbing up on these bookshelves in order to reach a photo of someone he loves. He's a toddler. He's 2 years old. He's up on the bookshelf. Like there's one story that's about him being naughty and having to manage his behavior,
Mm-hmm.
which would not be a story we would write, I imagine. But another story that could be written about that would be about his gross motor skills, that he is skillful at climbing, reaching. He held the photo with a pincher grip. Like there's all this
Uh-huh.
stuff that we could say about that absolutely diminishes what the story really was about. What touched my heart about that moment was the relational aspect. As Mandy, the teacher, was telling me about this moment of a child crawling, breaking a rule to climb up on furniture to get a photo, so he could bring it to the person he loved. It's like, that's a story of relationship. That's a
Uh-huh.
story of being willing to break a rule on behalf of connection. Like
Uh-huh.
that's a deep human story, and we can tell that story again by including our own experience in that. As I was watching Austin, my initial response was a concern for the rules and for safety.
Uh-huh.
But as I watched what unfolded, my heart really cracked open to learning more about how valuable relationships are, even to a toddler
Mm-hmm.
who is pre-verbal but a skillful climber. And he was eloquent today about how relationship matters and how love is a driving force in our lives. And that's a really different story, right? That's like a human story that does things start shifting, like breaking open those bordered worlds, those bordered ways of thinking
Yeah.
about what childhood is about and what is teaching about and what's education about. It's like, what if it's about that? What if it's about all of us just continuing to learn from each other about
Yeah.
inhabiting this world with as much generosity and kindness and empathy as we can?
Yeah. And there was definitely a time in my career working with young children where my focus would have been, and my goal was to prove that I was a teacher, to prove that I knew what I was
Mhm.
doing. And there was at that time, what I did with observing Austin in that moment would have been very different, and it would have been more about describing the fine motor and the gross motor.
Mhm.
And I do think that's helpful. I don't want to diminish that for people who are listening, but then I'm sort of to a point now where I would feel like what an honor it was to see that little boy take that risk for love and relationship, and that the moment required very little more from me.
Yeah.
Like, that's
Yes.
Austin's moment.
Exactly. It does require, though, this very big shift in you and a skillfulness in you to allow a moment like that to unfold and to witness it in that way. And that's that um, internal landscape, the dispositional landscape we can cultivate as educators and in the educators we work with, that is, as you say, a difference from that instinct to show that I'm teaching by doing something.
Yeah.
I'm worth the title
Yes,
educator
exactly.
because look, I'm demonstrating to you. But if someone had come into the room and seen Mandy watching a child climb up and get a photo,
Uh-huh.
that takes a different level of confidence for her to be able to say, no, hang on.
Mm-hmm.
Look what we, as you say, we are getting to witness the power of love. We should both be on our knees in gratitude that we
Yes.
have a moment in our day. How many people are going to get a moment like that today?
Mm-hmm.
So that's deep skill. And there's work to be done for all of us to continue to practice articulating that and
Sure.
articulating it from a place of confidence. Like, I'm an awesome educator because what I'm seeing. And I
Right.
know enough to be humbled by that.
Yeah. And even just thinking about what I just said a minute ago about how, at one point I was this way, but now I'm this way. Even then there's a moment of like, I said that because of my own ego. Like, I said that to say again how far I've progressed and how much you should all be impressed by me. And so there's always that little element.
Yeah.
But also, as you're describing someone else maybe coming into the room during that, there's another layer of sort of relationship and trust. We have to be working on the relationships with the people who might come in and see us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Engaging
Absolutely.
in the classroom. And that's a whole other layer of
Oof.
difficulty and commitment.
Yeah. Yeah. But it asks not only those of us who are spending days with children to be increasingly skillful at describing to whoever walks through that door what we're thinking and seeing, and stand with me and look and listen.
Uh-huh.
But it asks folks, those of us who work with educators, who are directors or program administrators, or who run lab schools or do teacher training, to see the educators with that same heart that we hope the educators are seeing the children, that same baseline of humility and trust that something important is happening here. And my first work is to pause and give myself over to try to understand this moment that this educator is having, rather than come in with my own set of assumptions and expectations and my own little script running. Like, I want to see first the competence of the educator, just as we would hope an educator first sees the competence of a child.
Yeah. So that sort of, and I know that this could be a whole other episode, but would you talk a little bit about the thinking lens model? Because you just discussed sort of some lenses that we're seeing things through, and it's a recurring conversation throughout this book.
Yeah.
So can you give us a quick sum up
Yeah.
of that and how it works?
Yeah, the thinking lens is a particular protocol that continues to evolve. It was seeded in some in a beginning commitment years and years ago by a group of educators that I was part of, to let go of scripted curriculum and pre-planned activities, all planned out for a month. Like, oh, we want to be in a more responsive relationship to what's unfolding in the classroom. But it's pretty terrifying to just like let go of everything. Like, okay, well, I'm putting down all my little curriculum books, and what am I supposed to hold on to? And what can I hold on to that will help me keep my attention focused on the children from that place of delight and curiosity and humility, and a commitment to joining them in their thinking rather than asking them to stop what they're doing to think about what I think they should think about.
Right.
So what could we use? And we just developed what has grown into this thing called the thinking lens, which is a protocol that asks us to be self-aware, as self-aware as we can be, which is an ever-evolving process.
Right.
What is it about this moment that's touching my heart? Why am I paying attention to this? There's a lot I could pay attention to at any moment in the classroom. Why this?
Yeah.
And what about this is intriguing me? And what about this might be engaging for the children? What's their perspective here? And how can I expand my thinking about it so I'm not jumping into an assumption that my first interpretation is the right interpretation? How can I keep busting open my thinking? And how can I do all of that thinking before I take an action? So that can be as quick as Mandy there watching this kid get up on the shelf and having that initial instinct, I see something, I need to react right away. Get down, that's it, boom, time out for you, bub. Versus, what if I take 3 breaths in which I notice, boy, I'm having a big reaction here. Why am I having that reaction? Is there a need to act from that reaction or not? What might be happening here for this child? Is what's happening here, where is the value that I see in that, and how can I be in service of that? Well, now I can take an action that comes from a different place than a reactive place. And it's, this thinking lens can sound very belabored, but it also can be internalized in a dispositional way to just get self-aware, stay always connected to our core values and to that place of curiosity. What's happening here for the children? I'm joining my attention to the children's attention. That's, I think, the key to the kingdom for us.
Yeah. That's a much gentler way. Like, there are times when I say things like, what kind of, it's so the audacity of the teacher who thinks that they know what a child is thinking or learning in that moment. And no, that's maybe a harsher way to approach all of that lovely process you just said. There is so much more to it. And I love that idea of, what if we just take the 3 breaths and think, why am I responding the way I am? Why do I think what I think about this situation? And I think it's another good example of process versus product, because I originally had just a little 1-page PDF with all the thinking lens questions, and my goal was to like journal about things with the thinking lens. And then I realized it's much more useful for me to just sort of practice having those questions in my head, so that in the moment and in the process, I can engage with it rather than turning it into this academic.
It's so tricky, because these tools we create always have that double edge to them. Right. Like, how can I internalize it and then it's of absolute use? Or how can I formalize it and externalize it and then it's just one more thing I have to be accountable to? And
and I, that having that 1-page thing is wonderful, and it's hanging around different spots in my classroom so that I kind of constantly am faced with those questions. So it's become really useful for me, but it's much more about, it's a skill that you develop with practice and you work on it, and it doesn't just happen because today I woke up and decided to use the thinking lens.
Exactly. I'll focus on question 3.
Right. Today, this week is question 3.
I love your phrase that just calling out that audacity.
Oh, good.
I mean, what a great provocation to just, for all of us in this conversation today, to think about that. Where is audacity useful in our lives, and where is it really inappropriate? And I like thinking of that word alongside that idea of attention. That there's a guy whose book I read that the name is escaping me. The person is Matthew Crawford, and he's written a
Okay.
book on attention, and it's like a lot of neuroscience stuff that and it's not early childhood stuff. But so I got a tiniest bit of
Uh-huh.
understanding. But one thing he says early on is that attention is the thing that is most our own. It's this very intimate act of making something real. What we give our attention to is what becomes real to us. So the act of conscripting someone else's attention is an intimate and fraught act.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that next to that word audacious. Like, I have to really believe that it's worth me disrupting what is real to that child right now to interrupt it and to claim that child's attention for my own, rather than saying, I can say what I give my attention to is what's real to me. So what if I make the thing that's most real to me this child right now, and what this child might be thinking about or poking at, trying to understand if I make that what's most real for me by giving that my attention, well, that changes everything for me, rather than giving my attention to the rules that I've carefully hand wrote and put on the wall, or I know the assessments are coming, or the evaluator is going to be here next week. But no, what if what I make the primary focus of my attention be the children, and I join my attention to their attention, then that's a different kind of audacity. Then I'm going to put that other stuff to the side. I'm going to be audacious enough to give myself over to those children.
Yeah.
That's a great act of audacity.
Yeah. Yeah. And this whole conversation, I just kept thinking which day I would like to be part of. Which day would be my good day at work? Would it be the day that I'm getting all the checklists and I'm nailing all the things on the schedule, and I've gotten through everything I need to get through, and I've got some observations so I can plan an activity tomorrow? That's fine. I'm not saying that you're doing something wrong if that's how your day is, because certainly I do spend my days that way sometimes. But then this day of beauty, where we're seeing the love and we're seeing the humanity, and we're seeing that we get to be part of something that's really an honor. That I'm just getting emotional thinking about it, and I can't even put a sentence together to end that thought. But I think that's just a beautiful way to think about our time with children and the opportunities that we have when we're spending days with them.
Yeah, well said.
Was there, so I know that we talked mostly in our prep emails about observation, and we've kind of meandered a little bit. Were there other things you wanted to make sure that you said, or stuff you really, really wanted to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
Thanks for asking that. No, I love how we've meandered our way around these really core ideas that I hope are at the heart of the work all of us are doing in whatever landscape we're working in, whether it's a Head Start classroom or a lab school setting, or a third grade classroom, or an adult classroom, a college classroom, but that we all come to it from that place of humility and curiosity and delight, and a willingness to join our attention to the others. That I think of the landscape we're in right now as a country, with the call to say Black Lives Matter, that we can center Black lives in all our conversations. We can center the work of justice in all our conversations, and all our actions. And I think all of that grows from and is supported by this act of saying my primary commitment is to be curious, to be humble, to be in a place of empathy, to join my attention to your attention, rather than assuming that I've got it figured out. And that has so many reverberations.
Yeah. And that's a point where I have been shaken. Like, I really had reached a point of complacency where I felt like I had done my ally work and my anti-bias, and I've had to revisit that and admit that I was not being very humble in my responses to some of those things. Humility, I think, is hard, especially in a quote unquote education setting, because culturally it's such a top-down power imbalance when we think about how people learn from each other.
Oh yeah, yep, and that we white folks have been at the top of the top down for
For a
so
long
long, and
Yeah.
I think of again these examples we've been talking about of how we educators have been trained to see children's behaviors as good behavior or bad behavior, and who gets assigned the bad behavior label. It's Black boys more often than it's any other person, and just beginning to really hold those questions, I think, will contribute to this shift that we're wanting to make in our observation, in our documentation, the stories we tell, the heart we bring to our work. I got to listen to a teacher of mine and someone I learned from tremendously, Nadia Taylor, who's a faculty member at Las Positas College in the Bay Area, and she called so strongly for this act of centering the idea of Blackness, centering Black lives, centering Black children's lives, centering Black educators' lives, centering that in our conversations, and seeing how that shakes us up in all the ways we need to be shaken up, and sets us on a course towards some restorative justice that, again, is all braided together with all these ideas we've been talking about, a way of being in the world.
Right. And I think will be, as you said, come more easily to us if we have that habit of curiosity and empathy and that shared attention. I think that's a really great way of phrasing that. And shared attention means different things for different people in different fields, but just that idea that I'm going to give my attention to what a child is giving their attention to can be transformative in a lot of ways.
Yep. And I want to just clarify before we close, as I'm using that language of humility that's me centering my whiteness in that conversation, that I need to be humble that in this conversation. And there's other dispositions, other presences to be brought into the conversation by people of color, by Black and brown people. I want to be sure I'm clear that I'm not saying everyone should be in that place of humility, that in this that it's a disposition we all want to cultivate, but especially in conversations of racial justice, it's us white folks who have a role of humility.
Yes, I certainly meant myself when I was talking about that, because that's something I'm trying to work on more. Well, I really, really want to thank you for this book.
Oh, Heather, thank you.
And this conversation. I got it when it first came out and excitedly started it, and then realized it was heavy and it was asking some things of me. So I initially, I had a bunch of friends and we were going to do a book group and we were going to read it in a month. And then I was like, no. And honestly, it's taken me about a year to get to a point where I felt like I could even identify one aspect that I'd want to talk about.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful for it.
Oh, thank you. There is just a project just beginning for folks who are interested in reading the book and being in conversation with folks in some small groups of what we're calling study for action groups. And people can learn more about that on the Exchange website. It's a way to get folks connected in conversation groups across the country. So
that's great. I'll have to make sure that I link that information when this podcast comes out so people can find that. That sounds amazing. All right. Well, again, thank you so much,
Heather. Thank you so much. And it's been fun to talk. I love the energy of this conversation and the way it continues to expand my thinking. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome back anytime you want to have another conversation. All right. And thanks everybody for listening to another episode, and we'll see you again in a week. Bye, everybody.